So being able to simplify an image, we really need to be able to look past the little details and textures and look at the image as a whole. And this is where something called like average value comes in. Now, when we look at this forest, for example, when we first look at it, we see all these tiny little details, right? We see like these lights and darks, little tiny little textures on the bark, on the tree bark, or little branches and leaves catching highlights everywhere, right? But when we just squint our eyes for a bit, okay, just squint your eyes and zoom out a bit, right? Like this. We kind of start to blend these details together when we do that, right? And that is what we kind of mean when we talk about average value. It's like our brain is essentially averaging out all these little dark and little light spots in a given area. If I were to paint on top of that, it might be something like this. This area would probably be all grouped into this and this part as well. And then all these darks, would be grouped, right? And then you have the lights just sort of peeking through. Something like this, right? And then I would pick the same value I have here and use it for the ground. And you see how this creates like a much clearer read. You see? And I would also probably pick the same values I used here for the darks and use them here as well. So this is how I think about value grouping. Is essentially by just averaging out a section of an area, and that now becomes a value that I will use throughout the whole painting. This is a really crucial skill, right? Because we can't really paint every single leaf in shadow or every little pixel. We have to be able to look at a complex area and then have an overall average value for that area. And we have to be able to see images that way and design our own value groups. So once we establish like a value like this, for example, right? Like now we say, okay, this value exists on this image now. I have decided that this is a value that exists on the image because of this being the average of this area. Now, how can I use this value in other areas on the image? So when I have made a value, I want to think about how I can use that same value for another area of the image. And when you do that, you sort of naturally create like a 3, 4 value group, and that is how value group is made. It's when you decide an average value for an area and then another average value for another area, and then now you have created 2 value groups that you can use. Okay, so when you're painting, you might want to introduce a completely different value, but I would actually think about how you can use the existing values that already exist on the canvas to create these other groups. So yes, sometimes you want to be able to, introduce another value, right? Maybe you want a super bright value group that just isn't here yet on the canvas, but you need a good reason to do that. And once you introduce that, you need to think about how that value can now be used in other parts of the painting. So by doing this process, you essentially create natural value groups that exist in the image. And as we can see right here, we have this value, this value, this value, and this value. And this is like essentially a 4 value painting. And I find that 4 values is pretty sufficient to being able to describe a lot of information in a given painting. You really don't need much more than that, at least to sort of design your painting off of. You can start here and then take it to, as you progress the painting, you can add more, right? But this is essentially how you simplify an image.